So, welcome back to second semester or second quarter. Oh my gosh, I'm already ahead of myself. So, I'm going to try to do this video for you all, and I want to just go over what's happening for the time I'm out, which is Friday and Monday. So, thank you to Mr. Butler for being here. You should have picked up by now a notes packet in front of the class because you will need it as you watch a video of my presentation on classical conditioning, which is the first topic we're going to cover in the learning unit. This video and the presentation can be found in the Unit 4 module. So if you go into modules, you'll be able to see it. I'm going to just show you where you can find it by clicking on module, and you'll see there's Unit 4 module. Okay, so we're going to be in the classical conditioning tab, and that's really what we're going to be working on today. So I'm going to go back to the home page just to go over what's happening this week or for the next couple of days. So again, while I'm away, there are lots of practice questions in your notes packet, so I'll have Mr. Butler stop the video so you can work in your little pods and your groups to answer questions, and then the answers will also be provided when you resume the video presentation. There's also a pause in the video, so in groups you're going to complete 4.P.1, which is in the packet that's at the front of the room. It's your assignment packet. You will need one colored pencil or pen or crayon to complete it, so I don't know if we're going to get to it today. It might be tomorrow, but you may have to scrounge around and help each other out with that. And when the presentation with all the notes and activities are completed, you are going to then complete a check for understanding, and there's a link here in this tab for it. It's just an ungraded quiz just to help you check to see what you don't understand. So when I come back, we can go over it. And then it's a long participation activity, 4.P.2 in groups. You'll work on that. You may not finish it, but when I return, we will definitely be working on it in class together. Okay, so that's basically it. Nothing will be turned into Mr. Butler. I'm going to ask you to keep everything, and then I'll collect it from you. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the presentation by heading into the module. And I'm going to go ahead and get into classical conditioning. And I'm going to put this in full screen. And I think I'm going to see if I can just turn myself off here. You don't need me. Okay, so we're going to talk about our learning unit. It's called classical. The first part of it's classical conditioning. We're going to be covering both classical and operant conditioning. So when we talk about learning, we're talking about any kind of change in knowledge or change in behavior. And because you learn new things every day, right? You learn now what classical conditioning is. That's a relatively, hopefully, permanent change in your knowledge. And of course, you learn behaviors, and those behaviors come from the experiences you have. You learn that if you come to first period late, you're not going to necessarily get as much time to take the test. So that's learning. Habituation we covered in our last unit, and it's similar to sensory adaptation, but really what it's about is once you've been exposed to a stimulus over and over again, for example, the alarms, the fire alarms that go off during our fire drills, you kind of get habituated to that. You no longer respond or behave in the same way as when you first heard them. Okay, maybe at first it maybe not startled you, but surprises you to hear a fire alarm. But then you become habituated to it. You've been exposed to it so much, it really isn't going to create any kind of sense of urgency. So that's habituation. So I want to take a look at how learning here is demonstrated in this video. And I don't know that the audio in this is working, but I think you do actually need the audio. Okay, so what I'm going to have Mr. Butler do, because it's not really working, is I'm going to have a link to this learning video so he can pause this video now, and on that page, while I'm away page, is a link to the first video about habituation. So you can go ahead and pause this video and come back to it when you get to it. Okay, so hopefully you saw that learning was demonstrated because people have learned over time that when they hear like the screech of tires in a car that they could potentially get hit by a car, right? So people jump away. Now we know habituation occurs if indeed somebody hears the screech of tires all the time, and then maybe they work at a racetrack, or I don't know, maybe they work in a tire shop, auto shop, and they hear the screech of tires, so it doesn't really faze them. That would be habituation. So I'll talk about classical conditioning, and classical conditioning is when we associate one stimulus with another. And I'm going to play upon this famous experiment done by Pavlov, who was training his dog. He did a lot of experiments with dogs. And what he wanted to do was to try to create a dog salivation response in response to something other than food. So think about food. Even though you and I don't salivate in a way that you can see it, we do salivate when we smell food, and dogs more visibly salivate when they see food. So in this case, Pavlov's dog, he had an unlearned or an unconditioned stimulus, which was the smell of the food, which elicited an unconditioned or an unlearned response, which is the salivation of the dog. Unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. Food, salivation. Then he introduced a neutral stimulus. And when we talk about a neutral stimulus, it's any stimulus that doesn't really elicit a response, a behavior. Like, if I showed you my coffee cup, it wouldn't necessarily initiate any behavior to you. Or as you look at the flag at the front of the room, it doesn't necessarily initiate a behavior. Okay, so what Pavlov did is he took a neutral stimulus, which was a bell. Normally, yes, a dog might pay attention to a bell, but that's about it. And what Pavlov did is he rang the bell, presented the food, and of course, because the food was presented, the dog salivated. But after a while, the bell was no longer a neutral stimulus. The dog anticipated or associated that bell with the presentation of food. And just by ringing the bell alone, it produced a response of salivation. The bell was no longer neutral. We now call it a learned or a conditioned stimulus. And the dog salivating at the sound of the bell alone is now a conditioned or a learned response. And this is the basis for classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is when an unlearned stimulus is paired up with a neutral stimulus, and eventually the neutral stimulus brings about a response, a learned response. Let's take a look at another one. Let's take a look at somebody who might be allergic to hay. Hay and being allergic to it is an unlearned stimulus and unlearned response. So in this case, the unconditioned or unlearned stimulus is a bale of hay, which produces an unconditioned or unlearned response of sneezing. Now, let's say every time you remember Butler's Orchard, probably went there a few times when you were younger, or some farm, which the barn itself, the site of a barn is neutral. Yes, you'd pay attention to it, but you're not going to sneeze or cough or choke or get sick, right, at the site of a barn. But the barn is a neutral stimulus, and initially it produces no response other than some attention. Eventually, though, just by seeing the barn alone, you start to associate it with the bale of hay and being the allergic response of sneezing. So now, simply by seeing the barn is now a learned stimulus, a conditioned stimulus. And if you sneeze when you see the barn, it's a conditioned or learned response. Now, I want to note that with classical conditioning, we're talking about responses or behaviors that are very much autonomic, right? They're not things that you necessarily control. Salivation, sneezing, your heart rate going up, flinching when somebody throws something in your face, right? Those are things you don't learn. And that's what classical conditioning is about. It's about behavior that is kind of an unlearned behavior, okay? An unlearned response. Okay, so right now what I'm going to do is have you practice number one. And what you're looking at is a scenario that every time somebody flushes a toilet in the apartment building, the shower becomes hot and causes the person to flinch. Over time, the person begins to flinch automatically after hearing the flush before the water temperature changes. Now, this is an example of classical conditioning because flinching in response to an unpleasant stimuli is an automatic response. So you go ahead and pause the video and talk in your group, and we'll come back and I'll give you the actual answers to it. So please pause the video. Okay, now that you're back, let's go ahead and take a look at the answers here. And again, you can pause the video to take a look at these answers. The answers here was that hot water is an unconditioned stimulus, which produces an unconditioned response, a behavior of flinching. Initially, there was a neutral stimulus, the sound of a flushing toilet. Yes, initially you would pay attention to it, but you wouldn't really respond to it. But since it's been paired with the hot water, you flinch at the sound of a flushing toilet. Okay, let's take a look at number 2. Again, you go ahead and pause. Okay, now that you've come back to it, let's take a look at the answers. Spelled incorrectly, I have to fix that. This is an example of classical conditioning because nausea is an automatic response. So take a look at my answers, even though it's spelled incorrectly. And let's move on to practice number 3. Once again, pause it, and we'll come back with the answers. And here are the answers here. Okay. Okay, let's talk about acquisition schedules. Now, this is the basis for 4.P.1, the first one, but we're going to take a look at how we acquire, and a lot of studies have been done about how we acquire these classically conditioned responses, like sneezing when you see a barn, or flinching at the sound of a toilet flushing. So we talk about acquisition. It's really about the formation of some learned, remember another word for learned is conditioned response to a stimulus. And we learn them through the presentation of some kind of a conditioned stimulus or reinforcement. And we haven't gotten to reinforcement yet, but if you write down this definition later on, it will make sense, the word reinforcement. So if we look at acquisition, we could, as Pavlov did, produce or present a neutral stimulus like a bell before you bring out the unconditioned stimulus, the food. And you do so by just a second or so, and that's called forward or trace conditioning. Ring a bell, a few seconds later, food is presented to the dog and the bell stops being rung. Okay, so this is a very effective way to get somebody to acquire a conditioned response. It is a type, delayed conditioning is a type of forward or trace conditioning. And it's actually when you have the bell, that neutral stimulus, presented before the food comes out, but there's a small overlap. So the bell's rung, and while it's still being rung, food is brought out to the dog, and then shortly after that, the bell stops being rung. Okay, and this, along with forward and trace conditioning, is the most effective. So delayed and forward and trace are similar, and they're very effective ways to create an acquired response, a learned response. Okay. Another way in which you can train someone to acquire a response is through simultaneous conditioning. And as simultaneous would indicate, both the neutral stimulus, and so if we take Pavlov, we're talking about the bell, and the unconditioned stimulus, the food, are presented at the same time. Now, there's much slower acquisition of the conditioned response. I mean, it's hard for an organism to associate two things when they overlap completely like that, but learning will eventually occur. It might just take a long time. So that is simultaneous conditioning. It's definitely not as effective. Then you have the one that's not effective. No learning occurs. And that's when the unconditioned stimulus, like the bell, the unconditioned stimulus, like the food, precedes the neutral stimulus, the bell. So imagine this. You're trying to train your dog to salivate at the sound of a bell, but you bring out the food and then you ring the bell. You bring out the food and you ring the bell. And guess what? The dog never learns to associate that bell with food. I mean, sure, they know when the food comes out, maybe a bell is going to get rung, but that doesn't elicit, the bell alone is not going to now elicit any kind of salivatory response. And so backward conditioning is a no-no thing. No learning occurs. Temporal. Now, the term temporal, we might think of temporal as in like the temporal lobe, but temporal is about time. So temporal conditioning is the conditioning with the use of time. And you all may note that you have been temporally conditioned to be hungry at a certain time. Now, hunger is an unconditioned or unlearned response. Now, what if that response simply comes as a result of the fact it's been 5 hours since you last ate, and you're used to eating every 5 hours, and then 5 hours about hits, like you ate at 8 o'clock this morning, and about 1 o'clock this afternoon, you'll start to feel hungry. Even if you're not really hungry, you might start to feel hungry. Even if you just ate like 30 seconds ago, you might not be hungry, but you'll still feel hunger. So that's temporal conditioning when time itself is functioning as the neutral stimulus, okay? Because just the passage of time wouldn't necessarily mean that you're hungry. So if Pavlov fed his dog at 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. daily, the 12 hours of time gone by is kind of a neutral stimulus. Eventually, of course, it becomes a conditioned stimulus. And every 12 hours, the dog will start to salivate, even if it had been fed 2 hours ago. Okay, so temporal conditioning is about time as the neutral stimulus. So this is where I'd like you to pause, and in your assignments packet for this unit, you will find 4.P.1, and I'm expecting that this is a good time for you to work on that with your classmates, and I would say this would be a good time to finish out Friday. I don't know that you're going to get much done beyond that today. In fact, I'd be happy if you would just get that done today, and then come back to the notes on Monday. So have a great weekend, and Mr. Butler will resume the video here on Monday. So it's Monday. Welcome back, everybody. We're going to move on with our notes. We just finished acquisition and 4.P.1, and we're going to now talk about we're going to go down to where underneath temporal conditioning in your notes is the term extinction. And we're going to talk about extinction and recovery. So we now know that Pavlov's dog salivates at the sound of the bell. But if Pavlov stops ringing the bell before the food is presented ever again, what do you think is going to happen to the dog's conditioned response? I mean, if the dog hasn't heard the bell in a few months, is it really going to salivate when it hears the bell? Or let's just say if the bell rings, but there's no food coming out after that, will the dog really salivate if there's never any food that comes out after the bell is rung? And if the answer is no, that's because the behavior or the response is extinguished. So extinction refers to the elimination of a conditioned or a learned response by removing the unconditioned stimulus, the food. So the bell gets rung, no food appears. The bell gets rung, no food appears. Eventually the dog is going to stop salivating at the sound of the bell. Okay. Now you're going to write down this whole definition, and once again, it may not make sense with the term reinforcement because we haven't covered that yet. But write it down because it will make sense later on in this unit. Okay, let's talk about spontaneous recovery. Now, let's say 2 years later, Pavlov rings the bell, and the dog starts to salivate, even though no food's been brought out for a long, long time. But we would consider that a spontaneous recovery. It's called the reemergence of an extinguished conditioned response after a rest period. It does happen, and I'm going to show you an example from my own life about how that happened. Okay, here it is. So we're going to practice it. And what I'd like you to do is when you look through this, I want you to find evidence of acquisition of a conditioned response, extinction of that conditioned response, and then recovery, spontaneous recovery. So I used to be afraid of flying, and it's because I had experienced quite a few aborted landings while flying on business. Not to mention I flew with my grandfather on his plane, and he was honestly like a little bit of a reckless flyer at times. So I think I was just like a little generally anxious about flying. But after flying a lot for business and not really having any new bad flying experience, I actually started to like it. And I even started to associate flying with relaxation. Back in the old days, before you could use your cell phones on planes and before there was a lot of activity on planes, it was just a nice, relaxing thing for me. So again, I was afraid of flying because I'd had a few aborted landings while flying on business. After years passed, I no longer had any new bad flying experiences, so I actually started to like flying. But recently, I get nervous every time I approach the airport for a trip. So where is the evidence of acquisition, extinction, and recovery? So why don't you pause the video here and talk about that. Okay, so if we're back, there's the acquisition. I acquired my fear of flying because I had experienced quite a few aborted landings while flying on business. I started then to like it because I no longer was experiencing those aborted landings. So I started to like it. That's extinction. And then recovery. When it comes to recovery, I'm telling you, recently I just started feeling nervous every time I approach the airport for a trip. Okay, so that's spontaneous recovery. So that's an example of acquisition, extinction, and recovery. Now, what's interesting here is something called stimulus generalization and discrimination. Now, the term generalize, if I say you generalize something, like if you say, okay, I just met a person from Wooten and they're really rude, and then you start to generalize to all students at Wooten, they're really rude, that's stimulus generalization. So in the case of Pavlov's dog, imagine Pavlov's dog salivating, not just when the bell rings, but when the doorbell rings or the phone rings. Okay, and that means that Pavlov's dog actually generalized the stimulus of the bell. He generalized that to mean pretty much anything that sounds like a ringing sensation, a ringing tune. Stimulus discrimination is when Pavlov's dog starts to realize, okay, cognitively, like, wait a second, the doorbell rings, but I don't get food. The phone rings and I don't get food. The only time I get food is when it's an actual ringing bell that my master brings out. Okay, so that is stimulus discrimination. And in stimulus discrimination, it's when the respondent, the thing, the organism that's behaving, is able to distinguish between different yet similar stimuli. Okay, so it would be like if you think about stimulus discrimination or generalization, in my example, I might have generalized being afraid to travel, right? And I wasn't just afraid of getting on a plane. I might have generalized that to be fearful of buses and trains and automobiles. But eventually I'd find out, well, wait a second, I don't have aborted landings with buses and trains and automobiles. I only have them with airplanes, and I discriminate the stimulus and I say, I'm really only afraid of airplanes. Okay. So again, I don't think this video is going to work, so it's in the tab. There's a link to it that Mr. Butler can pause this video and see the Little Albert study. And Little Albert, what I'd like you to look at is where can you find an example of stimulus generalization, this very famous study called the Little Albert study. Now, I will tell you in this Little Albert study, it's a very bad video, but Little Albert was experimented on, and so we probably would say it's unethical now, but they classically conditioned little Albert to be afraid of a white rat. And then you'll see where the example of stimulus generalization is. So pause the video here and come back when you're done. Okay, so hopefully you saw in that video that little Albert generalized his fear of the stimulus of the furry white rat to all furry objects. That's an example of stimulus generalization. Okay. Okay, we're going to move on to higher order or second order conditioning. Let's take that original neutral stimulus. Remember, the neutral one is one that you would normally not elicit a negative response. So in this case, it might be the bell, right? Pavlov's bell was neutral. Once the original neutral stimulus, like the bell, becomes a conditioned stimulus, okay, so the dog learns now that the bell means meat or bell means food, food causes the dog to salivate. So the dog salivates at the sound of the bell. Now we can start using the bell, okay, as a unconditioned stimulus to create a new one. I know that sounds confusing. So Pavlov's dog is salivating at the sound of a bell, okay, which is weird enough as it is, but it is because it's thinking, oh, food's going to come out. Now let's take the sound of a bell and let's pair it up with something else. Like we turn a light on, which is now still a neutral stimulus. Then Pavlov rings the bell, and the dog now starts to associate the light with the bell, and it already associated the bell with the food, and now the dog salivates just when the light is turned on. Okay, kind of mull that one over, see what you think about that. I'd like you now to think about that in the context, and I'll have the video paused here, in the example I gave you on Friday, where you see a barn, and the barn now is associated with hay, which causes you to sneeze. So now you sneeze whenever you see a barn. Now apply that second order or higher order conditioning to that example. What might precede seeing a barn? Okay, and how could that be second order or higher order conditioning? So let's pause and talk about that. Okay, so hopefully you came up with some ideas, maybe just driving past a particular intersection, which means that the barn is near, might cause you to sneeze. That's been paired up with it. Or being in a particular car, or in a school bus because you always took school buses to Butler's Orchard or something like that. Okay, actually that was what I wanted you to do here. I should have let the video go on, but that's what we just did. Okay. The example I have here is that maybe just the song, Old MacDonald Had a Barn, could be played right before you see the barn, and now just simply playing Old MacDonald Had a Barn makes you sneeze. So obviously it was pretty undesirable for little Albert to be associating all furry white things with being fearful, right? So what we want to do is take a look at counter conditioning. How are we going to counter condition this? Okay, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, so counter conditioning is when you want to replace an undesirable response, like me being afraid of planes, or a little Albert being afraid of furry white objects. And you want to produce a more desirable response. So instead of fear, you want to have relaxation or calmness. Okay, so we use counter conditioning techniques in psychology to rid people of phobias. Those are irrational fears. But we also use it to rid people of bad habits. Okay, so let's take that stimulus like furry objects, which has an undesirable response of fear. A desirable response might be a calm feeling or no sympathetic response whatsoever. So you might take that white furry object and pair it up with candy or a mother's hug, which would then hopefully get the organism, or in this case little Albert, to be less likely to be fearful of it. We take the stimulus of smoking cigarettes. For a lot of people, it gives them an undesirable response of a calm feeling. Now, you might say, wait a second, that's a desirable response. Hold on one second. I'm going to pause this. Okay, sorry about that. There were just people outside, and you fifth period people know how much I hate that. Anyway, so let's take the stimulus of smoking cigarettes. And it produces an undesirable response called a calm feeling. And it's undesirable because you don't want to be smoking cigarettes to get that. So what we have done in counter conditioning techniques is to pair up smoking with a whole new unconditioned stimulus, like a pill that makes you nauseous every time you smoke nicotine. Okay, and now when people start to pick up a cigarette to smoke, they don't associate it with a calm feeling, they associate it with nausea. Okay. So let's take a look under the conditions under which learning does occur when we talk about classical conditioning. And a very famous model called the Rescorla and Wagner model, RW, or contingency model, states a very kind of basic but simple concept that says in order for learning to occur, okay, so if learning is going to occur, the conditioned stimulus meaning, let's say, the bell in Pavlov's study, the conditioned stimulus must reliably, meaning consistently, predict the unconditioned stimulus, food. Bell, food. Bell, food. So in order for learning to occur, there has to be a reliable prediction that when the bell is rung, food is brought out. An organism has to learn that one event signals the coming onset of another. The more predictable the association, the stronger the association. So expectations are important. Okay. If I had just had one aborted landing when I was flying on business, I don't know that I think it would have taken very little time for me to have my response extinguished. But I was flying into an airport, it was Boston Airport, and for some reason they were having a lot of problems with air traffic controllers one year, and it was like a constant flying, and as soon as we were about to land, the plane would pull up. And it happened a lot in the course of a month or two. So that became a very reliable prediction. Every time I got into a plane, I was like, it's gonna be scary, right? So expectations are important here. Okay. I also want to note that some associations are learned more easily than others. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this for when I get back. We're going to go over biological preparedness and Garcia's taste aversion studies. We're going to do that on Tuesday when I get back. But the remainder of today, whatever you have, I would like you to do the Check for Understanding, which is an ungraded quiz. And there's a link for it in that tab on the main homepage of Canvas. And the link is under the While I'm Away tab. And then, time permitting, you're going to start working on 4.P.2, and you can do that in groups. Okay, so I will see you tomorrow, and thank you so much, Mr. Butler, for subbing for my classes.